including providing additional support to NHS Highland to support financial recovery.
Edward Mountain.
I'm not sure what additional support that lays out, because the consequences of the position we're in is the cancellation of elective surgery. Added to this, the lack of an interventional radiologist and now the lack of a cardiovascular surgeon means that a perfect storm is brewing. How is this government going to really help NHS Highland tackle these problems?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, I've just set out the additional financial support we've given this year, and also the additional £14.6 million we've provided for this financial year again to help to support financial sustainability. And we are continuing to engage with them around the financial challenges which they face, and also to support them in some of the recruitment challenges which they have as well. But the member will also be aware of the very significant investment we have recently made in NHS Highland through one of our national treatment centres, which is a facility of over £40 million. It's providing improvements in the way in which care is being provided to patients in a range of elective procedures.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. Members will be aware that tomorrow is the first anniversary of the passing of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth. In the days that followed her passing, the Parliament came together to convey our sincere condolences to the royal family and to lead with people across Scotland tributes to Queen Elizabeth's remarkable life and, in particular, her bond with this Parliament. And in view of tomorrow's anniversary, we will have contributions from leaders before we move to First Minister's questions. And I call the First Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 1 year since the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, it does present a moment for reflection on a long and dedicated life of public service. I'm sure that colleagues will remember with great pride the beauty of Scotland's landscapes, but perhaps more importantly, the warmth of Scotland's people on Her Majesty's final journey. Her Majesty's deep fondness for Scotland was well known. It is here that Queen Elizabeth chose to spend her most private family moments each summer. And it is within the halls and gardens of the Palace of Holyrood House that Her Majesty welcomed thousands of community leaders, volunteers, artists, activists, faith leaders and essential and key workers in recognition of their service to Scotland. Presiding Officer, on behalf of the people of Scotland, I send my thoughts to King Charles and the royal family in their private remembrance tomorrow.
Thank you. And I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Tomorrow our thoughts will be with the King and the royal family on the first anniversary of the passing of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. 12 months ago, thousands of Scots gathered as her cortege made the final poignant 6-hour journey from Balmoral to Holyrood Palace as she had wished. Flowers marked the route in Ballater, bagpipes played in a boyne, farmers lined their tractors on the roadside, and thousands stood on the Royal Mile to pay their last respects. Our late Queen brought the country together in her life and in her death. The late Queen cherished Scotland, and in her passing, the country showed how much it cherished her. Tomorrow marks 1 year since we lost our late Queen, but every day since then we've remembered her warmth, her leadership, and her unstinting and dedicated service to this country for 70 years. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, our longest-serving monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, was a dedicated public servant, demonstrating strength, leadership and empathy when her country needed it the most. She brought our nation together at times of crises and left a legacy of compassion in the various causes she championed. She reminded us that despite our political disagreements and arguments, everyone here in Holyrood is here in the service of the Scottish people. Her kindness, wisdom and integrity are timeless values that we pass down through the generations. Scotland will remember her fondly.
Thank you. And I call Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the passing of Her Majesty ended a constancy in the lives of everyone in this chamber. It was a moment in time that will come to define the early years of this century. And across these islands, the Commonwealth and indeed the whole world, there was a collective sigh of sadness and thanksgiving for her life of service. And then, in the minutes and hours and days that followed the announcement from the Palace, Operation Unicorn unfolded with quiet precision. And I pay particular tribute to the staff of this Parliament and public service workers across Scotland for the many hours and days they dedicated to that task. From the roadsides of Aberdeenshire to the catafalque at Westminster Hall, those days showed Scotland and the United Kingdom at its very best. I think Her Majesty would have been pleased that so many marked her passing by engaging in the great British pastime of standing in line. So on this anniversary and all those to come, we hold the royal family in our thoughts and remember the extraordinary life and service of Queen Elizabeth II.
Thank you, and we will now move on to the next item of business, which is First Minister's questions. And at question number 1, I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I remind the Chamber that my wife is a serving officer with Police Scotland. As part of a pilot in the North East of Scotland, frontline officers are being told to no longer investigate certain crimes. SNP funding cuts are forcing dedicated officers to ignore criminal acts. Some victims of crime will report it to the police, only to be told it's not important enough to investigate. So will the First Minister tell us which crimes won't be investigated?
First Minister.
First of all, Presiding Officer, of course, Police Scotland's funding is not being cut. I'm pleased to say that despite UK Government austerity and recognition of the crucial role that police officers play, of course, we've just announced this week an excellent pay offer that I'm pleased that police officers have accepted, and the service is receiving an additional £80 million in resource funding in 23-24. Again, from the North East pilot that Douglas Ross mentions, let me quote directly from the news release that the police put out in that region. It says, on some occasions, crimes are reported where there's no associated threat, no risk, no harm, no vulnerability, and this is the important bit, also no proportionate lines of inquiry for local police officers to investigate. When this happens, our staff will inform the caller that the inquiry has been recorded and a crime reference number will be supplied, but no further action will be taken. That, to me, seems like a proportionate approach to tackling crime, Presiding Officer.
Douglas Ross.
So the First Minister is quite happy about that. That is incredible. Now, first of all, more pay for our officers is welcome. Fewer officers is not. And that's what we have now in Scotland. And the First Minister cannot dodge responsibility. This is a result of SNP funding cuts, and it's laid clear in the letter that he's just read out from Chief Superintendent Graham Mackey. But this pilot is unfairly treating communities in the North East as guinea pigs. They'll receive a poorer service despite paying their taxes like everyone else. In response to this, the Scottish Police Federation Chair David Threadgold said areas could be at increased risk as criminals target places where they know crime won't be investigated. Now, Humza Yousaf wouldn't let this rash experiment happen in Glasgow, so why is he content to let victims in the North East go without justice?
First Minister.
That is complete and utter nonsense, turning one community in Scotland against another community in Scotland. What else would you expect? What else would you expect from the divisive Conservatives? This, of course, is a policing operational matter. Let me pull up Douglas Ross on a couple of points. First and foremost, Scotland has more police officers per capita than England and Wales. And, of course, on significantly higher pay here in Scotland because we believe in paying our police officers fairly. In Scotland, we have 30 officers per 10,000 of the population in Scotland. That compares to 25 in England and indeed in Wales. Let me go back to the central point. What people in Scotland, whether they're in Glasgow or the North East, care about is ensuring that recorded crime is at low levels. And I'm pleased to say under this SNP government, recorded crime continues to be at one of the lowest levels ever since 1974, down 42% since 2006-2007.
Douglas Ross.
North East families shouldn't be paying the price for SNP funding cuts, and that is what is happening here. The Scottish Police Federation said this pilot could set a dangerous precedent. Officers are warning that this could be a slippery slope unless Humza Yousaf steps in with more funding. And even today, Audrey Nicholl, the SNP, MSP and convener of this Parliament's Justice Committee, has raised concerns about what is happening in the North East of Scotland. So will the First Minister tell us, is he going to act on these concerns, or is he going to let this happen across the country?
First Minister.
If Douglas Ross does not correct the record after the session, then he is frankly happy to be inaccurate and misleading. Because let me read again the facts. We are investing £1.45 billion in policing in 23-24, increasing the resource budget, increasing by 6.3%, an additional £80 million. So any suggestion that we're cutting funding, I'm afraid, is simply untrue. Let me go back to the North East Police, the press release that was sent out by the police in the North East, because this is an operational matter. Again, if crimes are reported and there's no associated threat, risk, harm or vulnerability and no proportionate lines of inquiry, then of course officers will give a crime reference number, the crime will be recorded, but no further action will be taken. So on this side of the chamber, Presiding Officer, we are ensuring our police are funded, we're ensuring there's more police officers on the street, but crucially we're ensuring that recorded crime remains at one of the lowest levels in 42 years.
Douglas Ross.
I think if anyone's going to be correcting the record, it's the First Minister, because of course we know that the Police Scotland's budgeted officer establishment has reduced from 17,234 to 16,600. There are less police officers on the beat in Scotland, and they are being told not to investigate crimes. And why are they being told? It's because of funding. And if the First Minister won't believe what I'm saying, maybe he'll listen to Deputy Chief Constable Fiona Thompson. She said the force is facing hard choices. She continued, the levels of service we provide to the public will inevitably reduce. First Minister, this is a direct consequence of SNP funding cuts. Officers don't have the resources to do their jobs. People who report crimes will be told tough luck, and it's open season for criminals under the SNP. So why is the First Minister telling offenders that they can break the law and get away with it here in Scotland?
First Minister.
Douglas Ross, with that question, demonstrates why he should never, ever be allowed to be First Minister of this country. Panicking people, alarming people, sensationalism, all for cheap political headlines, Presiding Officer, is what Douglas Ross is interested in. What we're interested in, Presiding Officer, is results. Those results see more police officers in Scotland than other parts of the UK per head. What we see is further investment in our police in comparison to the previous year. What we also see is lower recorded crime rates here in Scotland than when we took
Let's
office.
hear the First
What
Minister.
I would say to Douglas Ross is when he talks about difficult public finances, they're difficult because of Westminster austerity, because of cuts to our budget, because of austerity. Because of course, the disastrous mini-budget that Douglas Ross, just under a year ago, demanded the Scottish Government follow Liz Truss's path. And now he wants to see tax cuts for the wealthiest. So we'll continue to invest in our public services. And let me just say, when it comes to the public finances, Douglas Ross has no credibility whatsoever.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, the news this week of the risk of reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete known as RAC in our schools is causing understandable anxiety for parents, pupils and staff. The Government have confirmed that 37 schools have been identified as containing RAC. So can I ask when the Government first became aware of the issue and what steps it took? And also, will the Government commit to publishing the list of the schools impacted so parents and pupils have at least some of the answers they deserve?
First Minister.
Can I thank Anna Sarwar for his question. So we were informed and about RAC for not just many months, actually, for years. And that's why, for example, we ensured that our education leaders had the appropriate guidance from the Institute of Structural Engineers last year. We have been proactive over that period, particularly the Education Secretary has been proactive in relation to her discussions with local authorities to ensure we have a full understanding of the picture. I can confirm that, given that we have further information back from local authorities, that 40 schools have been identified that have RAC in them, and of course the appropriate mitigations have been put in place. In terms of Anna Sarwar's direct question, I think it's a very fair question. Yes, we will work with local authorities to ensure that that information is published. I would expect that publication to happen at the end of the week, not just a list of the schools that have been affected, but I think if we can give more information around the mitigations in place, that will give some confidence to parents and indeed to pupils and staff who are in those schools. So we are working with local authorities to ensure that information is published. And there is, of course, a statement later this afternoon where the Cabinet Secretary will lay some of that detail out.
Anna Sarwar.
First Minister, the Institute of Engineers say they began inspections in schools for RAC in 2018, and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service say they warned that buildings are at risk of collapse 2 years ago. So it is important to know what steps the Government took, especially as the First Minister said they have known about this for years. Specifically on the schools impacted, how many schools have either a partial or complete closure? How many are subject to the additional building works or emergency engineering support? And finally, what resources are being made available to local authorities to deal with these affected buildings?
First Minister.
So there's a number of questions which, again, I'm happy, if we don't get to the detail of, to write to Anna Sarwar in full detail. In terms of the mitigations in place, they vary from school to school to school. So various schools, for example, and other public sector owners of public sector buildings, they have taken a number of mitigations. If I take local authorities and schools, for example, St Kentigern's Academy in West Lothian, they've closed part of its estate, including the dining and kitchen areas. Preston Lodge High School in East Lothian has closed off impacted classrooms and other areas. So each school will determine, given the Institute of Structural Engineers guidance, will then choose to take the appropriate mitigation in place. Fire stations, of course, that have been affected as well, they already have put mitigation in place. And again, I'm happy to furnish Anna Sarwar with some of the detail. In terms of funding, we are, of course, aware of some local authorities wanting a discussion in around funding, and of course we'll continue to have those discussions with local authorities, but ultimately they are the ones who are responsible for the safety of the school estate. I did note the Chancellor of the UK, the Prime Minister, in fact, of the UK, say funding will be made in order to help with mitigations in relation to RAC, but I've seen in the last 24 hours, 48 hours, them roll back on that commitment. So we'll continue to have conversations with the UK Government. In fact, the Deputy First Minister wrote to the Treasury on the 16th of August last month to call for the allocation of additional funding to remediate RAC. But I know there's a number of questions Anna Sarwar has asked, and I'm happy to go back to him in writing with fuller detail.
Thank you. Anna Sarwar.
I welcome the commitment to publish a list of schools, and can I ask that public information to include what mitigations are taking place in those schools to give that reassurance to parents. The Government have delayed the next phase of their school rebuilding programme. Local authorities submitted bids a year ago. They were meant to get an answer by the end of 2022. And we know that at least five of the schools on that list contain RAC, although I suspect that number will be far higher. Those schools are still waiting, so this must be dealt with urgently. And this issue also goes beyond our schools. We know that 255 NHS buildings across Scotland are being surveyed for suspected RAC. So can I ask the First Minister when these surveys will be completed, when we'll have a complete list of all public bodies affected, and how soon will we have a timetable for any required remedial action so we can give patients, staff, parents and pupils the reassurances they deserve?
First Minister.
Again, I'm more than happy to furnish Anna Sarwar with further detailed writing if I'm not able to get to all the questions he answered. In terms of the school estate, we'll be making a decision on LEAP imminently, but we are also now looking at that programme through a RAC lens. I think it's important for us to do so. This Government does have a good record when it comes to building schools, or indeed substantial refurbishment of schools. Since 2007-8, we've had 1,098 school builds, or indeed substantial refurbishment projects that have taken place. And of course, Anna Sarwar will be aware that school estate statistics came out just a couple of days ago, and they show that 91% of schools in Scotland had a good or satisfactory condition rating. That's significantly improved from when we first took office. In terms of the NHS, a major study is already very much underway. NHS Scotland Assure are leading that. The desktop review exercise that took place showed that 254 buildings have 2 or more characteristics consistent with the presence of RAC. And the next phase of the survey has commenced, and 9 buildings have now been confirmed to contain RAC. That's from 40 buildings that have been surveyed. But I think, going back to Anna Sarwar's very original point, I think it's a fair one. We will work with partners, not just local authorities, but NHS boards and others, to see how much of that information can be put out publicly. I hope Anna Sarwar and others will appreciate that will be an evolving picture as these surveys continue to progress.
Thank you. Question number 3, Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to data showing that the attainment gap has increased.
First Minister.
In fact, the poverty-related attainment gap is narrower than it was pre-pandemic for National 5s, for hires and advanced hires. This shows progress in education recovery and closing the poverty-related attainment gap over the longer term. We've seen good progress in primary school literacy and numeracy, the latest data showing the biggest ever reduction in the gap. We've seen a record low poverty-related attainment gap and positive destinations for school leavers 9 months after leaving school, with record high numbers of students from deprived areas entering university in 21-22. All this, plus the ambitious aims local authorities have set, and indeed are setting for the longer term, it gives me great confidence that we're making good progress and our £1 billion investment in the Scottish Attainment Challenge is indeed having an impact.
Liam Kerr.
The First Minister chooses his data carefully, yet fails to acknowledge that the attainment gap between the least and most deprived pupils has widened for the third year in a row. And we must be clear that this is through no fault of teachers, pupils or staff. Now, whilst his predecessor promised to eliminate the attainment gap, his ambition, as set out in the programme for government, is limited to merely narrowing it. So what narrowed gap would be acceptable to this First Minister? And when does he project he'll deliver it?
First Minister.
First of all, of course, Liam Kerr is not comparing like for like. We are comparing, of course, this year's figures compared to pre-pandemic figures. And of course, Liam Kerr, what I would say to him is the emphasis that he forgets to put is that this is of course, a poverty-related attainment gap. And that's the very point, Presiding Officer, that poverty-related attainment gap. If Liam Kerr really cared about tackling it, he would use any of the minuscule influence he has within his own party to demand that they scrap the two-child limit, to demand that they scrap or reverse the reduction in universal credit, that they scrap, of course, the benefits freeze. Those three measures alone would lift 30,000 children in Scotland out of poverty. So while Liam Kerr may well wipe away those crocodile tears, we in this Scottish Government will get on with the job of protecting Scots from the harm of a Westminster cost of living crisis.
I call Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the First Minister for his answer to that question, but in many areas in Scotland, including Glasgow, the Attainment Challenge funding is being used to backfill cuts to core education funding. So can I ask the First Minister, why does he think that is? And does he accept that this dedicated funding put in place to tackle the attainment gap has failed to do so in a substantial way?
First Minister.
No, I've just said to the previous member, of course, that we are making inroads in relation to narrowing the poverty-related attainment gap. And of course, when it comes to funding for local authorities, that funding has increased in comparison to the last financial year. And what we're doing with that £1 billion Scottish Attainment Challenge is making sure that we're giving £520 million to the pupil equity funding for head teachers, direct funding also for all 32 local authorities for the first time, and additional funding to support care-experienced children and young people's attainment and well-being. What I would say to Pam Duncan-Glancy, who I know cares deeply about these matters, is that we can only go so far in relation to the poverty-related attainment gap, because when it comes to reducing and tackling poverty, we have some of the powers, but I'm afraid the substantial levers are still in the hands of a Conservative UK government. I want to change that. I hope that Pam Duncan-Glancy does too.
Question number 4, Emma Harper.
To ask the First Minister whether he will provide an update on the steps that are being taken to reduce drug deaths in Scotland.
First Minister.
We remain absolutely committed to delivering the national mission to reduce drugs deaths and improve lives of those that are affected by drugs. The latest drug death statistics that reported a 21% decrease in 2022. I do welcome that reduction, which is the highest on record, but I'm also quite clear that these numbers, of course, remain far too high, and every life lost is an absolute tragedy. My thoughts are with the families that have been impacted and affected. That's why the national mission includes an additional £250 million investment over the course of this Parliament to improve services and backs radical approaches that are evidence-based, and that phrase is absolutely crucial, whether that be a proposal to establish a safer drugs consumption facility or arguing for drug law reform. The Minister for Drugs and Alcohol Policy will make a statement later this month to update Parliament more fully.
Emma Harper.
thank the First Minister for that response. The Misuse of Drugs Act is over 50 years old. It's not fit for purpose and it must be reviewed urgently. And the Home Affairs Committee recently published a report calling for a review of drug classification and a new health-led approach to tackling drugs with a trial of safe consumption rooms. So can the First Minister provide an update as to what engagement the Scottish Government has had with the UK Government regarding the urgent need to reform of the draconian Misuse of Drugs Act?
First Minister.
The points Emma Harper makes are well made. And in July, the Scottish Government did publish a paper, as Emma Harper said, setting out our bold and ambitious proposals for drug law reform to ensure we treat problematic drug use as a health, not a criminal matter. And I was heartened that there was much support for it, not just domestically, but internationally and globally, from experts and those who are working on the ground to tackle the issue of drugs misuse. This is complemented by the recent very welcome report, as Emma Harper said, from the Home Affairs Select Committee, which is clear for the need to reform the Misuse of Drugs Act. The Minister for Drugs and Alcohol Policy did meet with the UK Minister for Policing on Tuesday this week and did raise the issues with him. And what I would say is that if the UK Government won't take the necessary actions to use the powers that they have to help us to combat this challenge, this problem, this crisis, then at least devolve the powers to us so we can take a different approach here in Scotland.
Call Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Dogs Against Drugs charity assists Police Scotland with search and seizure of illegal drugs arriving in Shetland, alongside its educational preventative work. Police Scotland's Shetland Area Commander has credited the dogs with a vital role in drug seizures in Shetland, with a value of around $750,000 in the last 18 months. And one dog, Thor, is retiring and is credited to have found an estimated £1 million worth of illegal drugs over its 9-year career. But without core funding, the charity's future is under threat, and if it ceases, it will likely cost the taxpayer more in the long run. And I have recently met with the Justice Secretary to discuss the issues. But I wonder if the First Minister would agree with me that Dogs Against Drugs is an important asset to both Police Scotland and the Shetland community, and that it would be a significant loss were it to cease.
First Minister.
I do agree with Beatrice Wishart. I know of the programme Dogs Against Drugs. I remember them well when I was Justice Secretary, and funding, I know, has been an issue for a long period of time, and that's why I was pleased that the organisation did receive some additional funding, I think, from the Serious Organised Crime Task Force. I believe it was a good meeting between the Justice Secretary and Beatrice Wishart, and of course, if there's anything more we can do to try to support Dogs Against Drugs, then of course we'll be open to that in a very difficult within the difficult financial circumstances we're operating in.
Question number 5, Michael Mara.
To ask the First Minister, following the publication of NHS Tayside's due diligence review of documentation held relating to Professor El Jamel, whether the Scottish Government will immediately approve an independent public inquiry.
First Minister.
This is a deeply important issue, and I can inform the Chamber today that Health Secretary Michael Matheson will use his statement to the Chamber this afternoon to confirm that the Government has decided to commission a full independent public inquiry. This comes after very careful consideration of the recent due diligence review, which said concerns about Professor El Jamel were not acted on with the urgency they deserved. In commissioning an inquiry, it remains important that those people directly affected are still supported to find the answers they need, and that both staff and patients across Scotland know that lessons are being learned. The Cabinet Secretary has considered the latest report on NHS Tayside, and we have collectively concluded that this requires investigation independent of both the Board and indeed of the Scottish Government, and I agree with that. He will set out, the Cabinet Secretary for Health will set out the details of the next steps in his statement this afternoon.
Michael Mara.
Scottish Labour welcomes that inquiry. It should not have taken us so long to get here. This inquiry has been wrung out of the Government like blood from a stone by Jules Rose, Pat Kelly and the many victims who were weeping outside this Parliament yesterday, many in permanent, debilitating pain. As late as last week, the First Minister and Health Secretary maintained a public inquiry would not take place. And that damning internal review that he mentions from NHS Tayside says they knew El Jamel was incapable and dishonest and yet allowed him to continue unchecked. That review also revealed that the NHS Tayside Board has done nothing to deliver on a raft of recommendations from previous reports into this scandal. What will the First Minister do today to ensure those recommendations are acted on immediately?
First Minister.
I say that I disagree with Michael Mara's characterisation. Both the Health Secretary and I have always said that a public inquiry has not been ruled out. But I hope Michael Mara would understand that it is appropriate that we allow reviews like the due diligence review that was taking place to progress right to the end of its conclusion. And in doing so, having seen the extremely disturbing detail of that due diligence review, the Cabinet Secretary for Health, and we discussed this at Cabinet on Tuesday, the Government has come to the conclusion that a public inquiry is therefore necessary because of the failings that that report has exposed. So let's be clear about two things. First and foremost, that Professor El Jamel is responsible for his despicable actions, but where there are systemic failings, then they must absolutely be exposed, they must be interrogated, and lessons must be learned, and that's why public inquiry is so importantly. And secondly, let me agree in a point of consensus with Michael Mara that while many MSPs, I have to say, deserve credit for raising these issues, it is, of course, to the credit of the brave patients who have spoken out about the suffering that they have endured. Jules Rose, Pat Kelly and many others that have raised these issues. They deserve the credit for this announcement around the public inquiry. There is still a further question for us to explore, and Michael Matheson will lay this out in detail in his statement. It is whether or not there will need to be another process alongside the public inquiry that answers the very individual patient questions that rightly patients have in terms of their individual cases, something that a public inquiry would not necessarily be able to do.
Liz Smith.
Thank you. Can I also welcome this decision, but can I pay very considerable tribute to Jules Rose, to Pat Kelly and to all the other patients who for 10 years have been fighting this case. Could I ask the First Minister if, aside from the public inquiry, the Scottish Government will consider a victim support fund for the former patients and their families?
First Minister.
Again, there are, of course, as Liz Smith knows well, appropriate routes in relation to compensation that families can go through when it comes to health boards. And of course, if there are other avenues that we can explore to support patients, then we will give that consideration. But there are already established avenues for patients who have suffered as a result of the NHS to be able to claim compensation. But they can at times be difficult to navigate, so we will give consideration to any other avenues of support that we can provide. I do want to mention that there's been a good cross-party effort. I know MSPs such as Shona Robinson, Joe Fitzpatrick, John Swinney, Jim Fairley, Graham Day, Willie Rennie, Michael Mara have all raised these issues, but I think it is important to pay perhaps particular credit to Liz Smith, who has raised these issues for many years diligently and in a considered manner, and I thank all the MSPs who have raised these important issues on behalf of the patients they represent.
Question number 6, Ross Greer.
Thank you. To ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government plans to maximise the economic benefits, including the number of new jobs that result from any growth in renewable energy sources, including onshore wind.
First Minister.
Scotland has the skills, the talent, the resources to become a global renewables powerhouse. We're investing almost £5 billion over this Parliament in the energy transition and finalising an onshore wind sector deal, including halving the average determination time for new Section 36 onshore wind applications, as well as maximising the benefits for Scotland's economy, but crucially also for local communities. We're determined to maximise the opportunities from offshore wind as well, and welcome the commitment of developers to invest an average of £1.5 billion per project in the Scottish economy. We're embracing the opportunities that a flourishing clean hydrogen sector will bring, helping to support jobs, boost energy security and open up export potential. Our finalised energy strategy and just transition plan will set how we can maximise those opportunities, including jobs in renewable energy and energy supply chains and a highly skilled, flexible workforce.
Ross Greer.
Thank you. I thank the First Minister for that answer. Wind power in Scotland is growing. That's good for our climate, jobs and our economy. In fact, onshore renewables grew last year at almost twice the rate in Scotland than in England. And this programme for government will further unlock growth in green energy. In contrast, this week the UK government failed to genuinely lift their absurd wind farm ban in England. The Tories are wrecking our climate and holding back growth in a key industry. But the Scottish Government must do more to capture the benefits of this and other growing green industries for the people of Scotland. So can I ask the First Minister how the new Green Industrial Strategy and the sector deal for onshore wind will create new jobs and supply chain opportunities across Scotland?
First Minister.
Ross Greer is absolutely right about the damning approach that the UK Government have taken in the face of all the scientific evidence of the climate catastrophe that is unfolding right now. As I announced this week, we are establishing a sector deal. I think that sector deal will be incredibly important because of the scale of potential that we have to realise that collective ambition of 20 gigawatts by 2030 and deliver that in a way, Ross Greer is absolutely right, in a way that benefits local communities. And that's why this deal that we are negotiating will enable increased investment in skills, training and indeed in additional investment in communities. It will create pathways for long-term sustainable energy jobs, supply chains, with a focus particularly on the circular economy opportunities. Furthermore, building on our final energy strategy and just transition plan, we will work closely with businesses and industry to develop that green industrial strategy by summer of next year. This will set out how we will help businesses and investors create good, well-paid jobs as part of our fair, green and growing economy.
Ivan McKee.
Industry, including industry body Scottish Renewables, is clear that to maximise the economic opportunities from renewable energy, there is a need for a robust, evidence-led, action-driven green industrial strategy, including addressing challenges on skills and investment that government and industry can deliver on together. Can I ask what plans the government has to bring forward that strategy and the timescales involved?
First Minister.
Again, we will work closely with business and industry to develop a green industrial strategy by summer of next year, setting out how the Scottish Government will help businesses and investors to realise the enormous economic opportunities, including jobs of the global transition to net zero. The strategy will build on that final energy strategy and just transition plan to offer that clear evidence-based view of the economic sectors and industries in which we have the greatest strengths and most potential. We'll do everything we can to support them to thrive. Of course, some of these levers are very much in our hands. Many of them, particularly when it comes to incentives, tax incentives, financial incentives, lie with the UK Government. And that's why I wrote to the UK Government this week to urge them to have a discussion in around some of the good ideas that I think were in the Hunter Foundation report by Sir Tom Hunter's Foundation around using the economic levers, whether they're in the Scottish Government's hands or indeed in the UK Government's hands, to their maximum effect to boost growing sectors like the renewable sector in Scotland.
Thank you. We move to general and constituency supplementaries, and I call Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, over recent weeks there have been continued disturbances at the new prison facility HMP YOI Stirling, which is causing great distress to local residents. The incidents include screaming, shouting, swearing and banging coming from the prison at all times of day and night since it opened. Therefore, First Minister, what action can the Scottish Government put in place, together with the Scottish Prison Service, to tackle and rectify these disturbances, which are being described by locals as a living hell, and support these vulnerable offenders?
First Minister.
Well, we certainly don't want local communities to be disturbed, to be inconvenienced in the way that Alexander Stewart articulates. So I will ask the Cabinet Secretary for Justice to write to Alexander Stewart to see what more can be done. Of course, the Prison Service takes its obligations seriously to the young people in particular that are within their facilities in order to hopefully aid rehabilitation and to also take their obligation very seriously in terms of the communities that they are in. So I will ask the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, who undoubtedly raises these issues with the Scottish Prison Service, to also meet with the member and see what more can be done.
Christine Graham.
Oh, I thought I'd been dismissed. Thank you. Recently it's been reported that Nature Scot over 5 years issued 46,985 licences authorising the culling of native wild species, including thousands of geese, also ravens and the iconic mountain hare. Does the First Minister share the concerns of animal welfare organisations, and indeed myself, at the size of these numbers? And I should have declared an interest as convener of the cross-party group on animal welfare.
First Minister.
I noticed it took a bit of time, as Christine Graham wasn't sure if she was being called. Do forgive her, Presiding Officer. She's quite new to this Parliament. In terms of the serious question that Christine Graham raises, those numbers do, I think, cause us all to pause and to reflect. Nature Scotland, I know, takes the issue of licensed control of wildlife very, very seriously indeed, and it's only done where there's no alternative. Licences are only issued in accordance with strict criteria laid down in law. However, there are occasions when wildlife does need to be controlled, where it presents a risk to human health or safety, and therefore, as I say, these decisions are not taken lightly at all. And these decisions can also involve, for example, considerations of protecting air safety around airports, safeguarding food production and retail environments, and protecting crops in fields as well. As part of the Butte House Agreement, we will undertake a full review of the species licensing system during this Parliament, but I will also ensure that the appropriate Cabinet Secretary and Minister investigates the numbers that have been raised by Christine Graham and writes back to her with a fuller response.
Jackie Bailey.
COVID rates are rising and 2 wards at the Vale of Leven Hospital have been closed due to COVID. The number of beds occupied in hospitals across Scotland is also going up, putting even more pressure on the NHS. Now, we know that vaccination is an important line of defence, yet there appear to be problems with the vaccination programme. A couple in their 70s booked for their COVID and flu vaccinations, but when they arrived this week at their vaccination centre, they were told that there was no COVID vaccine available. They and 350 other people were sent home. Can the First Minister tell me if he is aware if there is a problem with the supply of vaccine, and when will COVID vaccines actually start?
First Minister.
No, I'm not aware of any problem with the vaccine programme or indeed the vaccine supply or stock. It's in good supply and a good stock is my understanding, but I will ask the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care to examine that point in further detail, and again write to Jackie Bailey in that regard. Jackie Bailey is absolutely right. The vaccination is the best form of defence in relation to COVID, and we can't and we are not as a government complacent about the fact that COVID is still within our communities, still harming people and of course still causing impacts to our public services, including our NHS. And the very specifics, if Jackie Bailey would be able to furnish us with the details, I'll ensure that specific incident is those specific incidents are looked into, and we'll give her assurance around the vaccination supply and stock.
Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The disaster of Brexit that Scotland didn't vote for has, amongst other things, narrowed opportunities for some of our young people. With that in mind, can the First Minister update me on what proportion of school leavers have gone on to positive destinations?
First Minister.
Well, this summer we had very encouraging statistics indeed that showed that over 93% of 21-22 school leavers were in a positive destination 9 months after the end of the school year. This is the highest level since comparable data was first gathered in 2009-2010. And the member is, of course, right to note that Brexit has narrowed opportunities for young people. And one of the most damaging examples of this has been the UK's decision not to participate in Erasmus+. We're determined to ensure young people, particularly from our most disadvantaged communities, can benefit from educational exchange opportunities. And that's why in the programme for government, I committed to developing the Scottish Education Exchange Programme, delivering some of the opportunities to our young people which Brexit has robbed them of. But I'm afraid anything we do as an alternative to Erasmus+ will never quite be as good as the Erasmus+ programme in the European Union. And those in Scotland know that the only way Scotland will be able to rejoin the European Union is as an independent nation.
Rose McCall.
Thank you. The First Minister will be aware of the repeated desecration of the Snowdrop Memorial Garden at Dunfermline Cemetery. Desecration of memorials is detestable. Words cannot describe how detestable these acts of vandalism are and the emotional trauma caused to the families of babies remembered at the site. Instances like these are happening too often, and it's left to volunteers to clear up the mess left by mindless vandals. So what more can the Scottish Government do to support our local councils with funding and resources for something as simple as CCTV cameras to deter these horrific crimes and help bring culprits to justice?
First Minister.
Ross McCall is absolutely right. These are despicable acts. There can be no words of condemnation that are strong enough to certainly, I think, articulate and express our collective horror at such acts of desecration. In terms of what more can be done, I'd be more than happy for the appropriate minister to have conversations with our local government partners to see if there's anything further we can do collectively in order to deter. I would say it's really important also that we try our best to work with anybody who is who's desecrating these memorials to see if there's more we can do to hopefully divert them from such despicable behaviour. And of course the police will determine whether or not there are crimes committed and what action can be taken. I do know one of our local councillors, Councillor Naz, I know him well, was one of the volunteers who was involved in cleaning up the baby memorial. And of course I commend the volunteers for cleaning up the memorial, but it shouldn't be left to volunteers. The desecration shouldn't be taking place in the first place, and therefore the government will reach out to the local authority and see if there's anything more we can do to support them in any action that they're taking to stop this desecration from happening in the first place.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the First Minister agree with me that the draconian proposals by the UK Government's Transport Commissioner about football supporters buses needs to be shown the red card?
First Minister.
Absolutely. I have no idea why these proposals have been touted in Scotland. I have no idea why the UK Traffic Commissioner, indeed the UK Government, think these proposals have any place here in Scotland. They're voluntary guidance, and therefore I suspect that they will be ignored, and I would support that action. I align myself very closely with the SFA, indeed the SPFL, the SWFL, many teams across the country who condemn these proposals. And they've come forward, I have to say, to Stuart McMillan and to other members without any consultation, without a single word of consultation with Scottish Government ministers, neither with the football authorities or indeed, most importantly, most crucially, I would suggest, with the thousands, if not millions, of football fans who would be negatively impacted by these proposals. So the Minister for Sport, Marie Todd, yesterday wrote to the Commissioner to better understand where these ludicrous proposals have come from, and the Scottish football governing bodies and football fan organisations have already issued very strong statements setting out their concerns, and they have my absolute full support in this.
Russell Findlay.
Thank you. 3 months ago, I asked the First Minister about a murderer and rapist who received a shorter prison sentence due to new under-25 sentencing guidelines. Since then, countless other violent criminals, adults by any definition, have also had their sentences reduced. So can Humza Yousaf tell the victims, most of whom are women, why his government will not step in and scrap this weak and dangerous practice in the Scottish justice system?
First Minister.
Of course, the member asked the question knowing fully the answer, that these, of course, are sentencing council guidelines. They are guidelines that are not made, derived, approved by the Scottish Government. They are, of course, approved by the senior judiciary. And if I know it can be often quite tempting, given how horrifying some of these cases are, and the cases that Russell Findlay mentions are absolutely horrifying. So I can understand the temptation for MSPs to demand that the government takes action. But of course, if we were to do so, we would be interfering in the very independence of the judiciary, which is a cornerstone of our democracy and a cornerstone of the rule of law. So sentencing decisions are very much for the independent judiciary. I am sure they will have heard the concerns that Russell Findlay, the concerns that many members have raised. But it is important to say that sentencing council guidelines are evidence-based. And what I would say to Russell Findlay to end on is that, of course, we have an important bill that will be going through this Parliament that puts victims and witnesses at the heart of the justice system, even more at the heart of the justice system than they are. And I hope that Russell Findlay and the Conservatives will support that bill.
Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that the new iPavilion in Edinburgh has suffered delay after delay. Over the past few weeks, fresh doubts in its 2027 opening have arisen after NHS Lothian told patients and campaigners that timescales would be confirmed once the Scottish Government had completed a review of funding and sequencing on a number of capital projects. So can the First Minister today confirm to Parliament that the new iPavilion will open in 2027, and will he meet with me and iPavilion patients to reassure them that the Scottish Government will fund this vital project, because it wasn't mentioned in the programme for government?
First Minister.
And of course, what I'd be happy to do is confirm that we are absolutely committed to the iPavilion. Sarah Boyack is right. There is a capital programme, capital review going on in terms of the capital projects that we are funding right across government. That review is very much still ongoing, and that's why we're not able to confirm the timelines. But we've had a significant reduction to our capital budget from the Westminster UK Government, and that comes, I'm afraid, has impacts, let alone the disaster of the mini-budget last year, which has meant that inflation costs, construction costs have risen exponentially. So that's why this capital programmes review has to be undertaken. And of course, when it is complete, we will ensure that Parliament is updated accordingly. I'm sure the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary, in fact, would be happy to meet with Sarah Boyack and indeed patients in the local area around their plans in relation to the iPavilion.
Thank you. That concludes First Minister's questions. The next item of business is a member's business debate in the name of Carol Mochan, and there will now be a short suspension to allow those leaving the chamber and public gallery to do so.
Thank you. The next item of business is a members' business debate on motion 10032 in the name of Carol Mochan on investing in alcohol services to reduce alcohol-related harm in Scotland. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would ask those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Carol Mochan to open the debate. Around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is unfortunate that today's debate is required, but I am pleased to have the opportunity to bring it to the Chamber. And at the outset, wish to thank Alcohol Focus Scotland, SHARP and others for the briefings they have provided members with ahead of today's debate. Presiding Officer, I'm pleased that the Minister is attending the debate, and I am pleased to see some government backbenchers attend as well. However, as of this morning, not a single SNP or Green MSP had actually signed the motion. And in his speech on Tuesday, delivering a programme for government, the First Minister did not mention recently released statistics regarding alcohol-specific deaths. And yet again, what we are promised is a review of strategy, a review of delivery, but action feels as far away as it ever has been. I offer these words to the Minister. If our approach to investing in alcohol services to reduce alcohol-related harm does not include accepting where we have gone wrong in the past, where we are currently getting it not quite right, then we are doing a disservice to those who already are and will become dependent on alcohol. their families, their friends and their communities. It is important that I note in total 1,276 deaths were attributed to alcohol-specific causes last year, 31 more than in 2021, the highest number since 2008. That is 1,276 individuals whose lives were lost before time, and their friends and families have lost a loved one. This is a public health emergency, and I think that we do all accept that. However, I join with key stakeholders today in asking why has the amount of alcohol-related harm and deaths not convinced this government that it is worthy of an emergency response? We have had no ministerial statement, no debate in government time, no real path to delivery from the First Minister or the Public Health Minister. We can do so much better. Those currently suffering due to alcohol-related harm deserve better, and so do the countless families, friends and communities who have seen too many lose their lives to alcohol without the correct support in place. Presiding Officer, taking a somewhat deeper look at the tragic announcement last week, there are further causes for concern. While male deaths continue to account for around 2/3 of alcohol-specific deaths, the number of female deaths increased by 31 in 2022. It's pivotal that we analyse this detail and do all we can to ensure that the increasing number of female deaths does not repeat itself, as well as reducing the number of male deaths, of course, from alcohol. As we see in this motion, while deaths are the most extreme form of alcohol harm, they're likely to be accompanied by increase in other harms, including domestic abuse and violence, and we know that can disproportionately impact women. I repeat, this is a public health emergency and highlight the importance of having a multi-layered response that addresses key factors, both in terms of causes, related harms and improving outcomes. Moving on, Presiding Officer, I often take the opportunity in this chamber to call for the reduction and eradication of health inequalities. As this motion states, the risk of alcohol harm is already greater for the most disadvantaged in society, with people in Scotland's most deprived communities reportedly over 5 times as likely to die and 6 times as likely to be admitted to hospital because of alcohol than people in the wealthiest communities. This is a devastating reality, but it is one that our most deprived communities have to live with every day. Of course.
Brian Whittle.
I'm very grateful for the member for taking the intervention. One of the stats that we've looked at this before is actually binge drinking is less prolific in our most deprived communities than it is in our least deprived communities. So it must point surely to the fact that there are less services available to our less deprived communities because of the misbalance or the imbalance in deaths for alcohol. I wonder if she would agree with that.
Cara Morgan.
Thank you for the intervention. My view on that is that it's an extremely complex picture, alcohol, and a lot of our difficulties in more deprived areas is they get much less access to services, but we also have a system which builds in inequalities, and so we have to look right across the board at what we can do to support these communities. The impact of alcohol harm are very wide-ranging and can impact anyone, but that in 2023 these harms are still felt so acutely in our most vulnerable communities is appalling, and we need to ensure an approach to tackle the public health emergency is underpinned by a desire to support those most in need. The approach needs to be preventative in its nature, tackling the root causes of alcohol harm, which perhaps comes back to the member's point, being strong in our approach to advertising where we have the powers to do so, putting people before profits, and for those already dependent, having the right support services in place through investment in our ADPs to give people an offer of hope in an otherwise incredibly challenging time. In concluding, Presiding Officer, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, this is not a debate any of us want to be having, but it is one that the situation we find ourselves in, it is necessary to have this debate. And it is a debate that we need to have on government time so families and communities can see how seriously the government is taking this issue. Alcohol-specific deaths in Scotland are at their highest levels in 15 years, whilst at the same time there are 40,000 more children living in poverty in Scotland than there were a decade ago. The link between alcohol harm and poverty is damaging, yet it is well established. We must do everything in our power to break that link. I once again pay tribute to the first-class organisation who research alcohol harm, who suggest ways through this emergency, those who provide services to those who are alcohol dependent, and are, of course, our great NHS staff who always do their best to act when they are called upon. They are all part of the fight, but they are being let down. They need a change of approach which shows urgency and tackles an emergency. So far, the Government has not stepped up to the mark, and I implore the Minister to take this opportunity today to come along and feedback and tell us how they will actually tackle what is an emergency for our communities. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Mochan. I now call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Sanjay Gohari. Mr McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, as co-convener of the cross-party group on drug and alcohol misuse, and also the Vice-Chair of Moving On Inverclyde, a local recovery charity, I want to thank Carol Mochan for securing this debate. And Carol Mochan also spoke in the debate I had on the 14th of June regarding liver cancer. The same issues relevant in that debate and also today. In recent years, there has been a greater focus given to tackling drug-related harm, which is welcome. However, many within the recovery sector have expressed concerns about the impact this has actually had on efforts to reduce alcohol-related harm. And as per today's motion, and I quote, with the reported 22% increase in alcohol-specific deaths in the last 2 years following the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure that we would all agree that equal attention must be given to alcohol-related harm. Now, locally, Inverclyde sadly reported the highest rate of alcohol-specific deaths in Scotland between 2017 and 2021, the majority of which were caused by alcohol-related liver disease. In addition, more than 1 in 4 people who live in Greenock and Inverclyde drink above the Chief Medical Officer's low-risk guidelines, placing them at the higher risk of developing alcohol-related liver disease. Now, this worrying local trend sadly reflects an alarming national picture across Scotland, as the number of people in Scotland whose death was caused by alcohol has risen again to the highest level in 14 years. Now, the motion before us today suggests that changes in drinking habits, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, have played a part in the recent spike in alcohol-related deaths. Now, through my involvement with Moving On Inverclyde, I genuinely can attest to this. Now, having been a board member for over 8 years, I've seen the organisation go through many changes in that time. And the reasons for people seeking help has also varied, and as we moved out of lockdown, Moving On Inverclyde found that an increasing number of people were in need of support regarding alcohol misuse. And that was a point that the Minister heard when she visited Moving On Inverclyde very recently over the summer recess. Now, it's easy to see that being stuck in the house for long periods of time with little opportunity to interact with others, either at home or in public settings, could lead to people drinking more heavily. It was always considered that other harms could follow on from the restrictions, and the impact that they had on those with substance dependence is clear now. And the National Records of Scotland figures show that 1,276 people died from alcohol-specific causes in 2022. Now, that's 3 people dying every single day because of alcohol harm in Scotland. Now, in concluding, Presiding Officer, I'd like to thank the British Liver Trust for bringing its Love Your Liver roadshow to Scotland earlier this year to help raise national awareness of the risk factors of liver disease, including excess alcohol consumption. And I hope to bring the Love Your Liver roadshow to Inverclyde in the autumn, so that people in my constituency can access non-invasive liver scans and learn more about improving their liver health. Now, FibroScan technology is quick and easy, it's painless, and could lead to my constituents learning whether they might have liver damage and being given a letter to take to the GP for further investigation. Now, this could actually help reduce the risk factors and ultimately save their lives. I do want to once again thank Carol Mochan for securing this debate, because I agree in terms of this is a hugely important issue facing the country, and there is no quick fix. If there was, clearly that would have happened by now. And I think the motion talks about a plan, but Carol Mochan in her contribution spoke about about urgency and emergency. Urgency and emergency are absolutely accurate, but to get a plan, that takes a bit of time to ensure, as well as that wide discussion and dialogue that is absolutely critical, so we can actually get to where we all actually want to be, to have fewer people in Scotland dying with alcohol-related harm. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Macmillan. I now call Sandish Gohani to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Dr Gohani.
Thank you. I wish to declare my registered interest as a practising NHS GP and to congratulate Carol Mochan for securing time for this most important debate. We have a problem with alcohol, including binge drinking, seen up and down our towns at weekends. And in my GP practice, I see many patients who have issues with alcohol, drugs and their mental health deteriorating as a consequence. Many patients I speak to do not realise that drinking, say, 2 glasses of wine after work to relax and unwind equate to about 42 units a week minimum. And with 14 units being what's recommended, it shocks them and they naturally want to reduce their drinking. So speaking to DrinkAware, I support their coming campaign to make more people aware of how much they are drinking. The SNP has been responsible for health in Scotland since May 2017, and 1,276 Scots died, with families who are grieving. Alcohol-related deaths continue to remain the highest since 2008, with people in our more deprived communities suffering the most. With regard to alcohol, the SNP has tried one flagship approach, which frankly makes alcohol more expensive to those who are less well off. And the trouble is, we know that they are going without food instead. The minimum unit pricing policy has now been discredited by yourselves. And it seems to be the only plan that the SNP have to tackle alcohol harms. So they put out a more convenient and positive spin on a Public Health Scotland report by shoehorning words like significant into the draft to claim a slam-dunk success. But there is no slam-dunk success. There was also a humiliating climb down when accused of misrepresenting the analysis by spinning estimates as facts. And they also implied, the SNP also implied, that resounding success was based on 40 studies. This is not true. So yesterday in Parliament, Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson argues that many leading experts have repeatedly said the MUP is making a positive impact in tackling the issue. What he failed to mention, however, is many evidence-based experts who questioned the analysis, and that's why the Scottish Government and its spin doctors had to rewrite their public announcement. Furthermore, and what is clear, and crystal clear, is that more people are suffering alcohol-related deaths now than in 2018 when MUP was introduced. In fact, men from deprived areas are drinking more with MUP in place, and others are switching to spirits. MUP has abandoned dependent drinkers. If we are ever to get a grip on this crisis, people suffering from dependence should have their right to access treatment and rehabilitation. This approach, a right to recovery, is backed by frontline experts. The evidence base suggests direct intervention actually works and improves outcome. So let's concentrate on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr Gohani. And I now call Pauline McNeill to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton. Ms McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to thank my colleague Carol Mochan for bringing forward this timely debate to highlight the rising levels of alcohol harm in Scotland, which is exacerbating health inequalities and adding to huge avoidable pressures facing our NHS at huge cost to our economy. I believe that Carol Mochan is right when she says it is indeed a national crisis, because the latest figures from the National Records of Scotland show that nearly 1,300 people died from conditions caused by alcohol last year in Scotland, and this figure has risen again to the highest levels in 14 years, up 2% from the previous year. So whilst we can always use different reference points and use different figures, what is clear is that the situation is getting more serious. Our most disadvantaged and marginalised communities are disproportionately impacted by alcohol harm. Shockingly, people in Scotland's most deprived communities are reportedly over 5 times as likely to die and 6 times as likely to be admitted to hospital because of alcohol than people in the wealthiest communities. The crisis directly impacts my constituents, and NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board area in my local health board, the largest in the country, recorded the highest mortality for chronic liver disease in Scotland. So it is indeed a crisis. This is unacceptable, and it highlights the need for urgent action to strengthen prevention and improve access to services. I want to mention in this debate the importance of facilities to help women offenders, a key focus for this government and previous governments. And the question that was raised yesterday about the 218 centres, something I know about because it was set up under a Labour administration, very, very important alternative to custody for many women, but those who are alcohol dependent. It faces deep cuts, and I just wonder how it really does fit with the strategy of women's offending and the crisis that we face. 6 months ago, Justina Murray of Scottish Families Affected by Alcohol and Drugs told the Criminal Justice Committee that one of the biggest barriers that prevents them from affecting change is around implementation. And she said, in Scotland, we're really good at writing down what we want to do. We have all the right things written in legislation, strategies and policies, but we do not implement what we say we will. We are good at saying what we are going to do, but we are not so good at doing what we should be doing. It's not really accountability in the system. So there are still significant failings in treatment, care and support services. Much more immediate work is required to reduce alcohol-related harms and deaths. Long-term funding of relevant services is absolutely vital in tackling the rise of alcohol-related deaths. We need services throughout the country, and the third sector needs to be funded appropriately in order to sustain those services for the foreseeable future. Make no mistake, it is a public health crisis that should be taken as seriously as drug-related deaths. 21% more people died through alcohol than drugs in Scotland last year. We need to tackle both crises. That's clear. I think Stuart McMillan was making that point earlier on, and I agree with him. It's about time we view alcohol as one of the biggest threats to population health. Every year, alcohol costs Glasgow, the region I represent, an estimated £365 million. It equates to £615 per person. But aside from the horrific impact of alcohol on people's lives that Carol Malkin talked about, it does reflect a hugely detrimental impact of alcohol on economic growth and workforce productivity. Every life loss is a tragedy, so we must do more to ensure that vulnerable people have access to local community services and the resources to reduce alcohol abuse and alcohol-related deaths in Scotland. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I want to make special mention of Alcoholics Anonymous, an organisation, a fellowship that has helped millions of people. It means a lot to me personally. The mentoring system and the 12-step programme has given me the opportunity to try and understand alcoholism and the complexity behind it. And I realise that there's no one simple answer to all of this. But I do think it's an organisation that has something to offer in terms of the overall strategy. And I think Sandra Gohani talked about this. These are issues across all communities and across all classes, and how dangerous it is just to focus on one policy. It's my personal experience talking to people who have been seriously dependent, almost risking their lives, but being saved by services and being saved by Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the point I agree with Mr Gohani on, is that for those groups, they will literally do anything in order to get access to alcohol because of their dependency on it. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, there cannot be a one-fits-all solution to this. We need to realise it's a complex issue. And I once again thank Carol Malkin for bringing this important debate to the Chamber. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. I now call Alex Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Gillian Mackay. Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to echo thanks to Carol Malkin for securing time for this important debate. And I think it's important that we see government time in the Chamber made available to this vital topic. I'd especially like to offer thanks to campaigners who have fought tirelessly to bring this conversation to the public debate, some of whom are watching from the public chamber in the gallery today. And I hope that this debate can be the catalyst for more meaningful political action and, as I said at the start, government time as well. Because we've heard this is an emerging crisis, a hidden crisis, with over 1,200 people losing their lives last year alone to alcohol-specific deaths in Scotland, the highest figure in 15 years. That is something of note, macabre as it is. And behind each of those deaths, as we all agree, is an irreparable tear in countless families and communities. However, this statistic only scratches the surface of the harm that alcohol misuse is causing in our communities. I want to make it clear that when we discuss alcohol misuse, we recognise that, like other forms of substance abuse, it is a sickness caused by a multiplicity of factors, such as socio-economic ones, which I'll come to later, trauma, and even potentially genetics. It is essential, then, that any action that is taken is driven by this understanding, and more importantly, that we do so with compassion. Long-term effects of alcohol misuse, including long-term health and addiction issues, which can even impact future generations. At the beginning of this year, Scottish Liberal Democrat research revealed that over 1,100 babies have been born dependent on substances, including alcohol, since 2017. Alcohol misuse has other ripple effects, including the intensification of domestic abuse, child neglect, and family and relationship breakdown. I will.
Brian Whittle.
I'm very grateful to Alice Goldhammer. I've just listened to her talking about the impact on the unborn. Does he also recognise or we are starting to recognise the impact of fetal alcohol syndrome disorder as well, and about 170,000 people in Scotland could be suffering from that condition?
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm grateful for Brian Whittle's excellent intervention. It is vital we consider the impact that, the early days of life actually begin before birth, and what can happen in utero can lead to lifelong and life-altering consequences. It's something that I worked very closely with other colleagues on the Baby in the Bathwater Coalition before I came to this place. And fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is something that we need to talk more about in this chamber. So I'm grateful to Brian Whittle for that intervention. Here in Edinburgh, it is estimated that alcohol misuse costs the city over £220 million a year. Within the last 2 years, there's been a reported 25% increase in alcohol-related deaths, and of course, in large part, caused by the strictures of lockdown and the mental health impact of that. But we can't assume that with the abatement of the pandemic, we will see those numbers abate as well. And this supports expert theories that the COVID-19 pandemic has had lasting changes in people's drinking habits, which has subsequently led to an increase in high-risk and harmful drinking. The fact that alcohol misuse appears to be worsening is just one reason why we need that urgent